Hi, my name is Joe Bielecki. I'm president of Sokol USA, the Slovak Gymnastic Union Sokol, and I'm here to tell you a history of how Sokol came to be, what it was as it was created, how it grew, how it morphed, and how it came to be what it is today. So with that, you see this logo, a Sokol, or a falcon, because Sokol means falcon in English. You have the background of an American flag. Sokol was the creation of a Czech professor of aesthetics and philosophy at Charles University in Prague. The creator, or the founder, was Dr. Miroslav Tirš. He created the Sokol movement in 1862 in Prague. To give you a little bit of background, Tirš was, as we said earlier, a professor of aesthetics and philosophy. He was very interested in Greco-Roman philosophy and the Roman Empire, and he read a great deal of Roman philosophers and Roman history and Greek philosophy. And he created in his mind a movement. He was very captivated by an ancient Roman philosophical phrase, a sound mind in a sound body. And that was, in a sense, a starting point for his conceptualization of what he wanted to create in his movement. The Roman Empire, which is rooted in Greek philosophy, the drawing upon philosophy created sort of an equal playing field or a common unity culturally in the areas that the Roman Empire controlled, which was the whole Mediterranean region, as far north, and then it went up as far north as the north of England. Paris was controlled by the Roman Empire, Budapest as well, parts of southern Germany, Romania. It was a vast empire, all of Spain, Portugal, the North African coast, Egypt, Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, Jordan, well into Iraq, what's now Iraq as well. But there was, at a certain high level, a common Roman-rooted culture. And Tirš found this to be fascinating, and he explored their philosophies. He had an ideal philosophy as a result of all of these years of study and exploration of the Greco-Roman history and philosophy. So he decided to create a movement and root it partly in physical exercise and partly in intellectual things. So he called his movement the Sokol movement. The Sokol means falcon, as we've said earlier. And he drew upon some ideals. For example, one of the ideals is embodied here in this early postcard from the late 18, early 1900s. Rovnost, volnost, bratrství. And essentially that means freedom, equality, and brotherhood. And it was ironic because in the Habsburg Empire, where Prague was located, they had none of those three things. The Habsburg Empire was an empire ruled by an emperor in Vienna. It was very socially stratified. There were aristocrats who owned and controlled much of the country, and people were not equal. There was not brotherhood. There was not equality. And none of the small nations that comprised the regions of the Habsburg Empire were independent or free. Tirš focused upon his idea of, and this was a popular idea. For example, at the same time in Germany, there was a movement, a purely sport movement arising called the Turnverein. The Turnverein, or as we know it in English, the Turner movement, was a purely sport movement based on gymnastics and rhythmic gymnastics. Thiersch felt this was the starting point to create his movement. You combine physicality with intellectual concepts and goals. So, for example, here you see in the very early 1900s in Prague, a Sokol slet, one of the early slets, or the gatherings. A slet is a gathering of the Sokol members. And you see everyone's dressed identically. They're in uniform rows. They're doing calisthenics. And they focused on mass scale rhythmic movement. They all had lodges or Sokol halls in various municipalities. In larger cities like Prague, there would be multiple Sokol halls in different sections of the city. And what they were doing, they were inculcating certain philosophical values in terms of Thiersch's thought process down through the memberships. So people would come for sport, they would come and socialize, but in a sense, they were also learning and creating a sort of internal democracy. They were preparing, Thiersch's idea was to prepare the people for the eventuality of the dissolution of the Habsburg Empire and to inculcate democratic values and create that this movement would then help carry over into society. The early Sokol membership, even to this day, called each other brother or sister. They wore uniforms because the uniform gave a common level to everyone. It did away with, people, for example, at other entities would come in street clothes. Some would be richer or poorer. It did away with the appearance of economic wealth. The uniform made everyone equal, and their way of addressing each other as brother or sister made everyone equal. There was a somewhat limited hierarchy because you could tell in the leadership, there were uniforms for different levels, for example. So a national leader would wear something on his uniform, for example, that would indicate that he was a national leader or a lodge leader or a regional leader. But essentially, there was a level uniform. The uniform was actually rooted in struggles for freedom. For example, the early uniforms were, they wore light brownish pants and a similar jacket, and they wore red shirts, and they had caps. And these were takeoffs on the uniforms worn by the Garibaldi freedom fighters in Italy. And so under the surface, there were many things that sort of tweaked the nose of the Habsburg Empire, like the Sokol uniforms were really the uniforms the Italian freedom fighters wore till they got their freedom earlier in the 1800s. So that sets the stage. Now, much of what was happening, Thiersch also, and the early Sokols, they focused on things that were important. They looked at nationalism. They looked at the great past of their country, not the great past of the Habsburg Empire. But for example, what you see here are, these are men in Sokol uniforms in these various postcards. You see the Garibaldi uniform here. For example, the red shirt is very basic as well, a component of their uniform at that time. And you see them here as well. Who is this woman? This woman being elevated, carried on like Venus rising out of the sea. She's being carried on this giant shell by these jubilant Sokol members. or you see her beneath this great tree and all these people are coming to her. And there's the red, white, and blue, which were also colors of the early Czech flag and the Sokol flags. She is Libusha. Libusha was an ancient figure in Czech history. She was what we would call today a seer. She had visions. She was in the earliest misty days of the 500-600 AD, when society was very agrarian. There were forests. There was no organization, and the Czechs wanted to have a king and to unite the Czechs, and so she was a famous seer, and there was a group of fellows who came to her and said, Libusha, how will we ever find our king? How will we know? How will we know who he is? And Libusha, she goes into her trance and she tells them, your king will be Przemyśl, and you will find him doing certain things as you go. And he will create a great kingdom and a great city with a gigantic castle on a hill, and he will call the city Prague. So the delegation goes. Some years hence, they find a man doing exactly in this village what Libusha said he would be doing. It turns out he is Przemyśl the first, and he becomes the first Czech king and created a great kingdom. In fact, his kingdom became one of the most powerful kingdoms in the Middle Ages until they ended up becoming part of the Habsburg Empire in the 1400s. But Hirsch used these things very well. He inculcated nationalism in the Sokols, because it started in Prague. It was Czech at first. Very quickly, this idea of combining physical fitness, pro-democracy thoughts and ideology, and nationalism spread. By 1863, there were Sokol movements in Slovenia. By the 1880s, it went to Poland. And the biggest area where it was popular was in southeast Poland, in the what's now the former Habsburg Empire portion of Poland, called Galicia. It spread to Croatia, it spread to Serbia, Bulgaria, it spread to Bosnia and Herzegovina. Essentially, it spread throughout the Slavic world, and it became a vast movement, all predicated upon the ideals of Miroslav Tirš. Sadly, Tirš died young. But what happened was his movement lived on and became very strong. And you see many things. You can see the ideology in which it is rooted. What's here? The flag, the falcon, the city of Prague, Czech and Slovak symbols, the triple bar cross in the mountains, or the Slovak symbol. This is a Czech symbol, this is a Czech symbol, and this is a Czech symbol. You have over here the Sokol gymnast. This postcard advertises a Sokol gathering in the city of Brno in 1914, before the start of World War I. And what's the Sokol gymnast doing? His foot is crushing the head of the evil snake. The falcon is about to kill the snake. The snake represents the Habsburg Empire and all the things that Sokol stood against. It stood against monarchy, autocracy, it stood against stratified societies. And so this is very symbolic. Now, so the Sokols never outright, during the times of the Habsburg Empire, advocated for independence or revolution. They knew if they went past a certain level, they would be arrested for insurrection. But they knew how to walk a fine line. The movement caught on from 1862 to, by 1900, there were literally several million Sokol members. Even today, in 2022, there are more than 300,000 Sokol members just in the Czech Republic. But in these early times, a huge percentage of society was joining Sokol, partly for the ideals of physical fitness, partly as a gesture to show their opposition to the empire. And of course, there was always the component of fun, but this was an important movement. For example, you see the Sokols, the leader, and the younger gymnasts, and you see this misty cauldron that Labusha, the seer, would look into and predict the future. And what's the caption? Our free country. And they're doing this long before World War I started. They had the vision of a free country. Here you have the Sokol and the flag, the red and white flag, and the caption is Rovnost, Volnost, Bratrství, equality, freedom, and brotherhood. Here you see in 1908, there was going to be a Sokol gathering in the city of Prostejové, and here's the women's Sokol uniform. And the women all wore the same style of uniform, much like the men had their tan and red uniforms. These were the uniforms of the women. But they were all inculcating values. And Sokol gave nationalism, they gave democracy and certain other ideals, and they gave sport. Now, these were all important, and this is exactly what Tirsch wanted to inculcate into the society in general. The sport component was very important. The Industrial Revolution had arrived in Europe in Tirsch's lifetime. And so you saw the rise of factory cities in Prague, partly parts of Prague. There were other cities all over the Czech lands that focused on industrial production. Ostrava, for example. Some were shoe factory cities. Some were metallurgical cities, like Ostrava was the Pittsburgh of Europe, or of the Czech lands. These were generally the conditions were similar to those in America at the time of the Industrial Revolution. You had overcrowded housing, bleak cities that were dirty with smog, soot, pollutions of all sorts. And the cities were growing exponentially as people were leaving the countryside. The cities did have many things to offer them. Of course, these jobs were often very hard physical jobs, but it offered them a different lifestyle from the purely agricultural society. It offered them larger cities, larger opportunities, and there was the transformation, the migration from country villages to large cities. In this era, there were not such infrastructure developments. For example, there were not necessarily large numbers of parks in these cities. There were not necessarily city-run athletic services or sport halls or things like that. And so the brilliance of Tirsch's movement was, of course, the Sokols all built their lodge halls. They built sport facilities. They gave these people interesting outlets for their energy. They became social centers. People came, and the early Sokols offered stage plays in their lodge halls. They offered lectures, and they became centers where these people who joined could develop themselves both physically and intellectually. And this was the fulfillment of Tirsch's vision. And it was a very brilliant concept. Nobody was really doing this at that time. And it grew and grew. As the country became more prosperous, it grew more. We'll show you some other things, early eras. You see, of course, the nationalism again. The evil bird with claws is being trampled upon by the victorious Sokol falcon and the gymnast. With the Sokol logo, that represents. Everybody knew. You didn't even have to write it on paper. It represented all the vile, evil things of the Habsburg Empire. And as long as they didn't openly advocate for a revolution, they could get away with it because they had like hundreds and hundreds of thousands of members. And the Habsburg authorities weren't going to arrest these guys as long as they didn't openly advocate for overthrowing the government. You have here in 1914 the Sokol gymnast, the red and white Sokol flag, Libuscha's vision of Prague, the castle on the hill, and he's trampling on the evil crocodile, the monster that eats everything and devours. He's trampling on him. And this is advertising a Sokol slut in the city of Brno. 1912, the victorious Sokol gymnast on a horse, on horseback, the falcon with the laurels of victory in its talons. Here is a photo of one of the very early sluts in the late 1800s in Prague. They grew to be gigantic affairs where you would have 100,000 people or more doing physical movements in stadiums, mass-scale rhythmic gymnastics. But this is one of the very, very early ones. And even in that era, say like the 1880, you see huge numbers of people present. And you see them doing their traditional grand march. They will break up and do rhythmic patterns across the field. And this was their tradition. And this was the vision of Miroslav Tirsch.